Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our subject this evening is generalization. How do you arrive at a generalization? How do you validate a generalization? Or to put it another way, our subject is induction, inductive reasoning. Now, I should mention that the subject of induction embraces other types of topics in addition to the topic of generalization. For instance, the whole question of theory construction or hypothesis formation in the sciences. When a theory is valid, what criteria a scientific hypothesis has to fulfill even to be legitimate as a hypothesis, that whole topic also comes under the term induction and is considered a form of inductive reasoning, the formation of hypotheses and of scientific theories. But the field which covers the question of theory formation is usually either the philosophy of science or a broader course in epistemology. That is not normally covered in a logic course, and since this is a logic course, we are going to restrict ourselves to that form of induction which involves arriving at and validating generalizations. Now, I want to give you an advance warning before we turn even to this narrower topic of generalization. I am presenting what is known today. What is the standard content on this subject in the field among philosophers and logicians? Now, we have comparatively little known in this field as against deduction. Aristotle and the ancient philosophers in general focused their attention on deduction and did very little on induction. Such as we have in connection with the topic we're going to discuss tonight is essentially a modern development, a development of modern thought, and the leading figures here are Francis Bacon, who put forth certain leads, and then John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, who essentially did nothing but systematize what Bacon had suggested. Now, at present, we do not have by any means a full theory even about the proper validation of generalizations. Philosophers have formulated some leads, but no full theory. And therefore, I do not propose to offer you one this evening. I'd like to remind you at the outset of what my brochure stated and promised in regard to the course. A discussion of the standard topics taught in introductory logic courses. And that is what I am confining my presentation to. I agree with what I will be saying tonight, but what I will be saying tonight is not objectivist and is not a full theory of induction or even of generalization. All right, let us begin. What is a generalization? In the simplest form, using the terminology we developed some weeks ago, you can say a generalization is any A proposition. Or if it were negative, it could be an E, but we focus just on the A's because the negatives don't introduce any different principles. An A proposition, as you know, is any proposition of the form all S is P. And any such proposition is known as a generalization. All crows are black. Fire burns, you wouldn't have to put the all in, but could imply it. Alcohol intoxicates, all men are mortal. Every case of typhoid fever is a case caused by the typhus bacillus, etc., and so on. All of those are generalizations. Now, why is this subject important? Well, for many reasons. To begin with, it is indispensable to deduction by the very nature of deduction. Deduction, as you know, is the application of a universal or general principle to a particular case, which obviously presupposes that you have arrived at some generalizations to serve as your premises. And ultimately, those generalizations have to be arrived at by inductive means. So without inductive generalization, you could never have deduction. Another essential point in this connection is that every definition that you formulate implies the advocacy and acceptance of particular generalizations. This is true, for instance, in connection with the rule of equivalence. Whenever you define, your definition must be true of every member of the class and only of members of the class. So if you're defining S in terms of P, you have to be able to say all S is P, and only S is P, or in other words, all P is S. So there are two generalizations you have to be able to validate simply on the rule of equivalence. And then, of course, in connection with the rule of fundamentality in definitions, you know that fundamentality is an issue of the causal relationship between two characteristics. One characteristic being the cause of another is said to be more fundamental. And any causal law is a universal, and consequently ultimately depends in some form, in some way, upon generalization. So the generalizations are indispensable to deduction. They're indispensable to definitions in many ways. And if you want still one more motivating point, if you remember in our discussion of validity under deduction, we said that there were two questions you had to answer before you could know that the conclusion of an argument was true. One was, is the reasoning valid? And we discussed that at some length. The other was, are the premises true? And I said at that time that we would postpone the question of the truth of the premises until a later point. Well, this is essentially the point I had in mind, because there are two kinds of premises. Particulars, which talk about some member of the class, some members, and universals, which talk about all members. Now, particulars pose no special problem of validation. If I say some men are tall, how many do I have to actually observe in order to warrant or validate a statement such as that? One is enough to justify the statement. So there's no difficulty in the typical case in validating particular statements. The problem of truth, if you call it that, of how to know whether your premises are true, appears most acutely in connection with the universal premises, the premises which say all S is P. In other words, with generalizations. So if we could work out some rules to validate generalizations, we would have solved the main problem in connection with establishing are the premises of your argument true. All right. How do we arrive at universal statements or generalizations? Well, obviously we only perceive concretes. Using our senses, we only perceive concretes or individuals. So we must engage in some process of observing particulars, concretes, individuals, and ending up with a general or universal conclusion. And that is what we will understand this evening to be meant by induction. So if you want a definition, and this would be an Aristotelian definition of induction, it would be the process of reasoning from the observation of concretes or individuals to a general or universal conclusion. The process of reasoning from the observation of concretes or individuals to a general or universal conclusion. Now I may say that this is not the definition of induction that would be offered by 99+% of logicians today. I will indicate simply in a sentence how they draw the line between induction and deduction and why I reject that. And the commonest way that logicians draw the distinction is to say that in deduction your premises necessitate the conclusion. Your conclusion follows conclusively, whereas in induction they claim the essence of what makes it induction is that the conclusion is inconclusive, uncertain, and follows only with a degree of probability, so you can never be certain of it. Now, I would never accept a definition which builds skepticism into the very nature of a form of reasoning. And consequently, I would reject that whole form of the attempt to distinguish deduction versus induction, and for this evening we will simply follow Aristotle. Deduction is starting with the universal and applying it to a particular case. In essence, induction is going in the reverse direction. Now, there are several possibilities of how you can employ this process of induction. One is, before you enunciate your generalization, survey every possible concrete that it would subsume. Survey every possible concrete that it would subsume. Now, if you did this, you would be engaged in a process which is called induction by complete enumeration. Induction by complete enumeration. Enumeration is obviously the means in this connection citing instances, citing examples, going through and counting up cases where your proposition holds. Complete enumeration means that before you would enunciate the generalization, you would exhaustively survey every concrete which conceivably could come under it before you would state your conclusion. Now, for instance, if I wanted to make a generalization by this method about every chair in this room, where my subject class is the chairs in this room on this date, and I said, for instance, this one has a back and this one has a back, and I went around laboriously investigating every blessed one, and at the end I said all the chairs in this room have backs, that would be regarded as an example of induction by complete enumeration. It is also by some logicians, the same process exactly, is given the name perfect induction. Perfect induction because you obviously cannot go wrong in this method. You've closed out all possibilities of error by checking every concrete separately before you make your general statement. Now, the only trouble with perfect induction is that in virtually every case it is impossible to apply, and therefore it's a completely, all but completely useless method. Imagine that you attempted to validate such a simple generalization as every drop of water is wet by complete enumeration. Well, this would not only require a spaceship to survey the entire cosmos, but a time ship that would take you to every drop of water in the past, the present, and the future. And of course you'd have to live an endless life, and you couldn't begin to make a dent on such a simple generalization as all drops of water are wet by complete enumeration. So we more or less include this simply to observe that this is not a useful process. It is contrasted with the form of induction which is given the name genuine induction. And in genuine induction, you really are generalizing, you see. In complete enumeration, there's not really a movement from premises to a conclusion. Your conclusion is simply a shorthand summary in one statement of what all of your observations contained, and therefore you haven't really engaged in any reasoning. But in genuine induction, you do not attempt exhaustively to survey every instance. You survey only some instances in the total class, the ones you're able to observe, and then you generalize to make a statement that is much broader in scope than the instances you've actually observed. You generalize to encompass the unobserved. So in genuine induction, you can put the nature of the reasoning in three different ways, which are simply three different forms of saying exactly the same fact. You can either say, your premises tell you about some members of the class, and your conclusion tells you about all. So the essence of your reasoning is to go from some to all. Or you can say, your premises tell you about what has been true up to now. In other words, essentially about how things have behaved in the past, counting the present moment as the last instant of the past. And your conclusion includes what will happen in the future, and therefore the essence of your reasoning is to go from what was true in the past to the conclusion that it will also be true in the future. Or you can say the essence of the reasoning is to go from the cases you have observed to a conclusion which embraces the cases you have not observed. You go from the observed to the unobserved. And in any case of genuine induction, this is the nature of your reasoning, from some to all, from past to future, from observed to unobserved. You observe some men are mortal, not all, because all the men yet to come you haven't even set eyes on, they're not even here yet. And you conclude all men are mortal. So you go from some to all. You observe the men up to now have died at a certain point, therefore you say men in the future will. The men you have observed die, therefore the unobserved ones will. In this type of reasoning, and that's all we're going to concern ourselves with for the rest of this evening, genuine induction, In the nature of the case, you do not observe all instances. You make a certain jump. You make, as it's called, a leap. Your leap being from some to all. And guess what would be a good name for the leap that you perform when engaged in inductive reasoning? It's called the inductive leap. Very good. And the big question that philosophers raise is what justifies this type of leap? And that is known as the problem of induction. What justifies the inductive leap? What justifies you in coming to a conclusion about every member of the class? Observed and unobserved, past, present, and future, simply on the basis of observations of some members of the class. Now you know that this type of leap is specifically prohibited in deductive reasoning. If in deductive reasoning your premise tells you about some members of the class, and your conclusion tells you about all, then if it happens on the minor term, we call that illicit minor, and on the major, illicit major. In other words, that would be the going from undistributed to distributed, which is specifically prohibited as a fallacy in deductive reasoning. And the argument was, you would be sneaking into your conclusion information that was not contained in the premises. Now here then we have a case that in induction, the essence of the process is something which is regarded as fallacious in deductive reasoning. So the question becomes, what justifies it? Now there are philosophers who say it's never justified. David Hume made his name and his claim to fame as a skeptic by an all-out assault on induction and saying, in essence, that this leap was never justified, that we could therefore never learn from experience. Now this is a broader philosophic issue, what justifies this leap, and I will be very brief in connection with it. On this broad question, Aristotle and Objectivism take the same essential view, namely that, to begin with, the validity of induction rests upon a certain metaphysics, a certain view of reality. You can formulate that view in various terminologies, but it comes to the same essential point, namely that there are laws of nature, absolute firm laws of nature. As it's sometimes put, the principle of the uniformity of nature, the principle that there are universal laws, that the same cause leads to the same effect, or putting it in the simplest form, the principle of cause and effect. Now, all induction, to begin with, according to Aristotle and Objectivism, all induction begins with the premise that it is a lawful, orderly world of cause and effect in which we live. And it's only on that premise that you can observe a pattern running through several concretes, and then, assuming you've properly selected them, conclude, well, this indicates one of the laws of nature. If there are causal laws, then you can get off the ground in connection with induction. You can say the instances I observe, assuming I select them properly, indicate one of those laws. On the other hand, if you take David Hume's metaphysics, according to which there is no cause and effect, everything that happens is a sheer, random, chance, accidental event. Well then, if he sees 50 zillion men grow old and die, he or his followers say, in essence, it's simply a staggering coincidence. There is no causality, and consequently you have absolutely no justification on that metaphysics in drawing any wider conclusion. What could happen to the next man on a Humean metaphysics is anything, literally anything. He might become mortal and die, he might turn into a pumpkin, he might dance the cha-cha endlessly on Venus, anything is possible, and induction would simply be wiped out. Now it is a broad metaphysical question to validate the law of cause and effect, and I don't want to, at this point, since that is outside the purview really of a logic course, to say much except to indicate to you in a sentence or so what is the essence of the Aristotelian objectivist viewpoint. This is essentially Aristotle's argument for cause and effect, but I'm not going to go at it in any length. But in essence, what it comes to is what Ms. Rand says in Atlas Shrugged, the law of causality is the law of identity applied to action. The law of identity tells us that everything which exists, every entity, has a definite nature. It is what it is. It's not anything else. It is limited and specific. And therefore, it only has limited capacities, limited potentialities, as a result of its limited specific nature. What a thing can do, Aristotle argued, is a function of what it is. Its potentialities are a product of its actuality. Well, if this is true, and it is incapable of having contradictory attributes, it cannot have a contradictory capacity. If in any given set of circumstances a thing had contradictory capacity, the same thing under the same circumstances, then those capacities would have to derive from contradictory elements in its nature, which of course is prohibited by the law of identity. And consequently, the whole Aristotelian tradition concluded under a given set of circumstances, an entity has only one capacity for action, namely that which is dictated by and compatible with its nature. And therefore, under those circumstances, that is what it will have to do. And in other words, the entity is the cause, its action is the necessary effect. Same cause, same effect. Same entity with the same nature and the same circumstances will necessarily have the same effect. That's a brief indication of the Aristotelian argument for cause and effect. Now we'll take that as the given for tonight. And now we have to face what you can regard as the epistemological problem of induction. The metaphysical problem, if you regard it as a problem, is, are there laws of nature? Is there cause and effect? But even assuming now that we have established firmly that there are laws of nature, that there is cause and effect, the key epistemological question in connection with induction is, how do you know in any particular case that you have discovered and correctly formulated a law? Maybe it's true that maybe Aristotle is right, the world is run by law, by cause and effect. We still need some criterion to let us know when we have found a real law and not been led astray. So that if we combine these 2 points, the metaphysical and the epistemological, you can say that a valid induction is based really on 2 facts. A, on the metaphysical premise that there is cause and effect, and B, that the cases we have observed in some particular situation are actually indicative of one of the laws of reality. In other words, that we have actually taken a valid representative sample. Now, we are going to focus for the rest of this evening only on the epistemological issue. How do you know when your cases are representative and you are entitled, therefore, to say they really do stand for a law of nature? Now, we will begin with the most elementary form of induction. And this one is called induction by simple enumeration. Induction by simple enumeration. Now, don't get it mixed up with complete enumeration. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, you can now forget complete enumeration altogether. I put it in just not to have to discuss it hereafter. This is genuine induction. That is, we really are going from some to all. And the simple here really means induction simply by enumeration, or merely by enumeration. In other words, nothing else is involved in this type of induction but enumerating instances. Let me give you now a formal definition and then illustrate. Induction by simple enumeration is the process of generalizing solely on the basis of the fact that all the cases so far observed without exception possess a certain characteristic. To repeat, induction by simple enumeration is the process of generalizing solely on the basis of the fact that all the cases so far observed without exception possess a certain characteristic. To put the idea a little more simply, All you do in this form is count up instances. You say it happened in this case, it happened in this case, it happened in this case, and depending upon your patience and pertinacity, you go on for some more cases, and at a certain point you say, I get the message, that's it, and you generalize and say it'll happen in every case. So you'd say, for instance, this man 1, you follow him around and he dies, so you write down on the board, man 1 is mortal. And then the next man 2 is mortal, man 3 is mortal, and so on. And at a certain point, you just draw a line and say that's enough, and your conclusion is, therefore, all men are mortal. Now, if you want to take it down symbolically just to get the structure, and if we use S and P for the, like man and mortal, your premises here would be a whole string. S1 is P, S2 is P, S3 is P, for however much you go, and at a certain point you draw a line and say, therefore, all S is P. That's induction simply by enumerating or counting up instances. You don't do anything else. Now, I may say this was the only type of induction that the Greeks or the medievals knew about. And it's a very simple, straightforward type of induction. Unfortunately, it has very grave problems. To mention here only two, which are enough to make you think very long before you plunge hastily into induction by simple enumeration. One, of course, major problem is that you may strike coincidences. You may strike cases which are not, in fact, indicative of any law, where it simply is your bad luck that the characteristics happen to go together, but there's no causal connection. Now, you, for instance, just randomly observe music critics, and you observe that the music critic on paper A is vicious. So you write down music critic 1 is vicious. And you observe that on paper 2 and paper 3 and so on, and after a while you say all music critics are vicious. Now, it very well could be the case, particularly if you lived in a more civilized world than today, that that was just your bad luck and that that isn't even a dominant trend in the profession. Now, induction by simple enumeration as such does not tell you. It says keep on piling up instances and at a certain point generalize. Well, that leaves wide open the fact that you could fall for coincidences. Even with a great number. You might, for instance, have looked at thousands of crows. I suppose all of your crows were, let us say, I don't know if there even are crows in Australia, but suppose you were in Western Australia and you watched thousands and thousands and thousands of crows. And at a certain point you say, well, all crows are black. You don't know whether there's a whole migration of albino crows on some other continent. You don't make any attempt in this process to show that there's an inherent connection between blackness and being a crow, or whether it's some other factor in these crows completely independent of their crowhood, so to speak, and that therefore you just simply have a coincidence. Now, there is a second problem that we can mention in connection with simple enumeration, and that is even if you don't have a coincidence. Suppose the things that you observe are really on the track of some law. You have the valid nucleus or basis for a law. You may, however, omit a necessary condition in your statement of the law, in your statement of the generalization. You may omit a necessary condition. In other words, it may be the case that it's not a coincidence, but the law in question holds only under certain conditions, and you have not grasped that it is restricted to those particular conditions. And you make an unrestricted generalization, when in fact you should have said it's true in all cases under the following circumstance. You omitted what's called a necessary condition. Now, the textbook examples of this are you boil pure water at sea level time after time, and you find it boils at 212 degrees, and so you generalize that water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, obviously, and you decide to go to the top of a mountain to celebrate your discovery, and you go up to the top of some big mountain and you boil water, and sure enough it comes out at 180 or something because the pressure conditions are different. Now there, it was not a coincidence that your water boiled at 212 all the time, but it was something that holds only under a certain condition, namely under standard pressure conditions. And you did not know that, and so you were tripped up. And there's any number of examples of this. You could not simply say alcohol intoxicates, because you'd have to specify. in a certain quantity, and of course also the system of the person is relevant. You have to specify what the type of structural conditions or chemical conditions or psychological conditions are involved, because a quantity that will intoxicate one won't necessarily another. Now, these are the two central problems posed by induction by simple enumeration. And logicians have worked out, on the whole, three criteria to try and shore up induction by simple enumeration and minimize the risks that it involves. And I will briefly indicate to you these three criteria. These are in the nature of advice or tips of what to do to make induction by simple enumeration less hazardous a procedure. One criterion is what is called the number and variety of instances. The number and variety of instances. And what the criterion says is, the more examples you have, and the more diversified they are, the greater the variety, the more likely your conclusion is not to be a coincidence, but to be justified. The greater the number of instances, and above all, the greater the variety. Now, I believe myself that the variety is really the key point here, not the number of instances. But for instance, you can see that, and suppose we just tried the following as a sort of a mental thought experiment. We had a group of 100 men, and that was the sole number on which we were going to try to generalize to the conclusion that all men are mortal. And let us suppose in one group, in our first process of induction by simple enumeration, these 100 men were all Americans, all had blonde hair, all were majoring in chemical engineering, and all were Catholic. And we observed that they all died. Now, we have 100 instances. On the other hand, imagine again you start from scratch and you have only 100 men. So the quantity of instances is the same. But they range over all nationalities, all color hair, including baldness, all different professions, all different religions. And they still all die. Now, obviously, the second, other things being equal, is much more convincing than the first. Because the first leaves open the possibility that the reason they died is that because they're Americans. And maybe the proper generalization is all Americans are mortal, or all blondes are mortal, or all chemical engineers are mortal, etc. The second, by the sheer force of the variety, eliminates those possible conclusions, because we have non-Americans and non-blondes and non-engineers and non-Catholics. And the idea is if we range broadly enough, we hope that finally there'll be nothing left in the sample instances except that which is responsible for their being mortal. We'll have eliminated all the irrelevancies by the sheer breadth of our examples. And that's really what the hope is when you try to employ the criterion of letting your instances be as varied as possible. You're trying to avoid coincidences by spreading yourself out as wide as possible to eliminate irrelevant factors. Now, this is, of course, very good advice, but it's necessarily very vague. How many instances are required? There's nothing in this method to say so. How do you know when you have hit a wide enough variety to eliminate accidental factors? There is nothing in this method to tell you. All it says is, keep on going, and the more the merrier. The broader they are, the better. But you see that there is a certain intrinsic weakness, therefore. There's no way, within the nature of this method, of giving you anything very precise. That's point one of the criteria that is recommended to minimize the risks of simple enumeration. A second one is, look for negative instances. Now, a negative instance simply means a case which contradicts your generalization. It would be, for instance, an immortal man, if the generalization is all men are mortal. Or a bit of dry water, if your generalization were all water is wet. Now, this is an important piece of advice, because one negative instance is sufficient to refute a generalization. A generalization is the unrestricted claim that every member of the class, whatever it happens to be, has a certain characteristic. If there is one case in which it is not true, that overthrows the generalization. So if you meet 10,000 men, 10 million who are, let us say, predatory, aggressive, hostile, and you meet only one man who is peaceful, non-predatory, non-hostile, etc., that one man is sufficient to overturn the 10 million in terms of the generalization. It is no longer true that all men are aggressive or hostile. Now, in this connection, I'd like to point out that there is an absurd expression which has gained currency, namely, such and such is the exception that proves the rule. Now, there could be nothing more irrational than the way that expression is normally used. An exception that proves the rule is a self-contradiction, as most people use it. If there's an exception, it is not a rule. Now, actually, that comes from a much older formulation in which the word proves meant establishes one way or the other the validity of the rule. And when you said this is the exception that proves the rule, it was understood originally to mean that proves the rule is no good. But the people lost that last part, and they now utter this fantastic statement. The only amendment I'll make to that is, if you have a great number of cases, other things being equal, it may not be the case that you have to scrap the generalization entirely. It may be the case simply that you have omitted a necessary condition. In other words, you do have the nucleus of a rule, as in the case of the water boil. If you found one case where it didn't boil at 212, you wouldn't necessarily say the whole thing is false. You'd try to identify, is there some condition involved? But what you do know is that if you find a negative instance, either the generalization is simply wrong in principle, or at the minimum, some condition must be put into its formulation to exclude this type of case. Now again, this is a valuable piece of advice, but the question is, when have you looked enough to find a negative instance? How long do you keep looking before you say, okay, there aren't any? And again, the rule does not tell you. Induction by simple enumeration says, keep looking. And at a certain point, you haven't found it, okay, but it is not specific. Now, the third and last criterion that I will mention, I regard as far and away the most important of the criteria. And that is the criterion of integration with other knowledge. Integration with other knowledge. Now, you know that the essence of human knowledge is integration. Connecting a new piece of information with what you already know. Establishing relationships between a new candidate for knowledge and the things already validated. Now, you will find in most cases of simple enumeration, or let me amend that, in many cases of simple enumeration, you will already possess other knowledge that will either tend to weaken and even outrightly negate a given generalization, or to strengthen and make it much more founded, depending upon the thing in question. For instance, you take this issue of all crows are black, take that example. Now, you could have a zillion instances. You could have scoured, so it's fine on the point of view of quantity. And let's suppose you've looked in every country, in the water or over the oceans, wherever crows could be found, so you've tried it on variety, and you haven't found a single negative instance. You still have other knowledge which keeps that a weak, unlikely generalization, which tends to negate it, and that is your knowledge that pigmentation, skin color, coloring of an animal, is one of the least stable attributes within a species. One of the ones which is least connected to the essential attributes of a given living species, and that varies most widely within a species. And so we have, for instance, human beings with so many different shades of color, and that's true of so many different living species. Well, that is other knowledge that, when you combine it in your mind with your knowledge that all crows are black, even no matter what quantity you have of black crows, will always make that generalization suspicious. When you combine it, when you integrate it with this outside knowledge. Or again, you may have hundreds and thousands of instances of human beings being rotten. But if you combine that, in this case, with a philosophic piece of information, namely that man has free will, doesn't make any difference how many instances you have. That integration with your other knowledge about the nature of man and his having a volitional consciousness wipes out the generalization. So sometimes you will find when you apply this criterion of integration with other knowledge, you enormously weaken or annihilate a generalization, even one with a great quantity of instances and no negative instances. On the other hand, sometimes you find that you enormously strengthen a potential generalization. Now, for instance, take such as a generalization as unsupported objects fall. Now, at a certain point in human knowledge, this is based only upon a huge quantity of instances and no negative instances. At the point where Newton came along and said, I will explain this on the basis of an explanation which will at the same time integrate it with the way the tides behave and the orbits of the planets and so on and so on. And I'll take this whole vast body of data and tie it all together on the basis of a few laws. Well, at that point, you can now deduce from a much broader principle, namely one or more of Newton's laws of motion, the information you originally arrived at inductively by generalization. And of course, that integration enormously strengthens what was originally based simply upon simple enumeration. And the same is obviously true for all men are mortal. The fact that you can integrate that with the nature of living species generally, and that you can therefore deduce it from observations which encompass all living species, and therefore man as one of them, obviously enormously strengthens the generalization, all men are mortal. Now, if I can very briefly here interject, in effect, an objectivist aside on this point, but this is simply an aside. This is not a formal objectivist theory of induction. I myself believe that you cannot rely on an inductive conclusion of any type, and certainly of a simple enumeration, simply on the basis of quantity of instances and absence of negative instances. And I believe that the crucial criterion is this issue of integration with other knowledge, but I think you can be a little more specific. I'm just saying this as an aside briefly. This is not part of a standard logic course, but simply as a clue, to a lead, to a hint, to a tendency, to a direction. I believe that you must be able to give at least the rudiments of an explanation of the generalization, showing how it is in the nature of the entities in question before you can validly claim it as a generalization. Now, as an example, suppose you found that, let's shorten the science involved because it's too boring to repeat it over and over. Let's assume that the facts are that if you don't have fresh fruit alone, that is enough to produce scurvy. I'm not going to list all the things, but just suppose that was enough. And suppose you simply observed a great number of cases in which people did not have fresh fruit and they got scurvy. I would say that you are not in very good shape as an inductive thinker if at that point you conclude all cases with the absence of fresh fruit are going to be cases of scurvy. But if, for instance, you could identify that fresh fruit contains a certain type of chemical, which we call vitamin C, which performs a certain role in the function of the organism, and that's why when the organism is deprived of fresh fruit, it gets scurvy. You haven't said everything you could possibly say about it, but you've made at least one attempted level of explanation to show that this particular consequence, scurvy, is inherent in the nature of the entity man under these conditions because of the role of vitamin C. Now then I think you've got something to go on in validating your generalization beyond simply enumerating instances. And that, you see, is still an issue of integrating with other knowledge. Now I stress you do not have to have a full explanation, because obviously a full explanation, if you mean you'd have to know everything in reality that contributed to it, the phenomenon, you'd have to be omniscient. But you have to have at least the rudiments of an explanation within your context of knowledge. You may not be able to explain your explanation. You don't have to go back forever, but you have to, I would say, have at least some inkling of an explanation. Now, for instance, to illustrate what I mean. Suppose it were the case that there was no aging process. Human beings remained absolutely in the prime of their life and form without any evidence of aging or deteriorating at all until 35. And then, at the day they reached their 35th birthday, they dropped dead. I would say no matter how many instances you have of that, in that stage of knowledge you'd have to say you haven't the faintest clue, not a clue as to why. And consequently that is suspect, that generalization. If it happens over and over, you begin to think it's not a coincidence, but on the other hand it would be simply a blank wall intellectually, and I would say you'd have to be very cautious about asserting it. But we do observe, for instance, the aging process. And we observe it not only in human beings, but in animals. We observe a gradual deterioration, which I don't have to describe to you, across a long period of time. Now, given that, you have at least a context in which to have the first step of understanding the phenomenon of mortality, because you can see it as a continuation, a logical extension of the general breakdown that living organisms go through at a certain point. And this is true even though you may not be able to explain the aging process. You've at least, at this context of knowledge, established some connection between the fact you observe, namely mortality, and something about the nature of the entity. And then, of course, you'd want to go further. Well, that's by way of an aside, so to speak, on what I regard as the key element in validating a generalization beyond simply enumerating instances. But I should note that you can very well come back to me and say at this point, but isn't it true that in the cases you cite, the other knowledge that you're integrating your generalization to and thereby supporting it with is very often itself inductive knowledge. For instance, I made use of vitamin C plays such and such a role, which is a universal generalization. Or all men undergo aging, which is itself a generalization. So therefore you could say, doesn't that imply, if we're not going to go in a circle, that if we're going to use this criterion to validate simple enumeration, and this criterion in turn relies upon some kind of inductive knowledge, doesn't that imply that we have some way of arriving at or validating inductive knowledge other than by simple enumeration? Mustn't there be some other form of induction beyond simple enumeration, in other words? And of course that is the modern discovery. But before we look at it, I would like you, if you're taking notes, start a list that you can entitle Inductive Fallacies. And I will give you 7 tonight. We'll spin them off as we go in connection with various points. And 2 of them I want to give you right now because they obviously pertain to simple enumeration. The first one is called simply hasty generalizing. Hasty generalizing. Z-I-N-G, zing. Hasty generalizing. Now, if you want a circular definition, this is the process of generalizing hastily. But a more formal definition would be an unwarranted usage of the inductive leap. That simply means hasty generalizing. In other words, that is when you go from particular observations to a general conclusion without justification. Now, I trust no one would dream of mixing this up with composition. And I hope I haven't confused you by raising that, so forget that. You observe woman 1 is a poor driver, and woman 2, and woman 3, and you conclude all women are poor drivers. That is a fallacy. That is unwarranted induction. This man likes the girl with her hair yellow, and this one does, and this one does, therefore gentlemen prefer blonde, etc. All stereotypes are formed by this method. You know, you see 3 movies and you conclude all Frenchmen spend their time in bed making love, and all Scotsmen are tight, and all Americans, Europeans conclude are mad about plumbing, etc. Racial prejudices, great many superstitions depend on this. You light 3 on a match a couple of times and you have bad luck, and thereafter it becomes a law. And of course, it comes from not examining enough instances, not a wide enough range of instances, ignoring negative cases, negative instances, and making no attempt to integrate with other knowledge. In other words, it's a poor usage of induction. Now, here's an example I found in one text. Quote, "It is necessary to confine criminals and to lock up dangerous lunatics. Therefore, there is nothing wrong with depriving people of their liberty." Now, that's what you call hasty generalizing. It starts with a premise about certain specific types of people, namely criminals and lunatics, and ends up with a conclusion about all human beings under all circumstances. And that is obviously a bizarre misuse of generalizing. Now, some students become so cautious and so concerned about not generalizing hastily that they proceed to say that they will never generalize in order not to commit this fallacy, and they end up by saying all generalizations are unreliable. Now, that, of course, is a perfect instance of hasty generalizing. They are generalizing from the few instances that they have encountered to a sweeping generalization, including all generalizations. And of course, it's self-refuting. If all generalizations are unreliable, so is that one. Now, number 2 on the list has either a Latin or an English name. The English name is oversimplified generalization. T-I-O-N. Oversimplified generalization. And the Latin name, although this name that I'm about to give you is used differently by different logicians, but we will use it simply as a synonym for oversimplified generalization, is dicto simplicitur. 2 words. Dicto, D-I-C-T-O. Simplicitur, or depending on which Latin pronunciation you were brought up on, simplicitur. S-I-M-P-L-I-C-I-T-E-R. Dicto simplicitur simply means, dicto means said, and simplicitur means too easily, too simply. So it's said too simply. You can call it just dicto, you know, as a personal friend. Now, in this fallacy, you start with a generalization from which a necessary condition has been omitted. You apply it to a particular case and end up with a false or absurd result. For instance, you start with the statement, water always boils at 212. This is water, you say on top of the mountain, therefore it will boil at 212. Now there, the structure of that argument is your premise is a generalization, but it is an oversimplified one which omits a necessary condition, and therefore you are led astray. Now you see that this goes the exact opposite direction from hasty generalizing. That's why I stress that one ends in ing and the other in shun. In hasty generalizing, you are actually generalizing. You're going from particulars to a generalization. Your conclusion is the generalization, but it's unwarranted. In oversimplified generalization, you start with a generalization. That is your premise, not your conclusion. But it is oversimplified, and therefore when you apply it to a particular case, you end up with an unwarranted conclusion. Now actually, the reasoning in oversimplified generalization is deductive reasoning. You're applying a generalization to a particular case. But it's regarded as an inductive fallacy because the essence of the fallacy is not in the reasoning, but in the general premise from which you have omitted a necessary condition. Now, there are many examples of this that do not pertain only to context from natural science. Plato gives an example, for instance, you ought to return what you have borrowed from a person when he asks for it. And then somebody, one of his dialogues, I'll vary the concrete, but the essence is Plato's point. A maniac comes up to you, he's foaming at the mouth and asks for the knife back that he loaned. And the person concludes, well, you ought to return what you borrowed, and here's the case of the person asking for it back, therefore I should give it to him back. Obviously omitting, in this case, the necessary condition that the person is not in such a state as to behave lethally with it. Or, you ought to help a friend. I'm your friend, therefore let me cheat the copy from your paper during the exam. Now there, you ought to help a friend, but obviously have to be qualified suitably. Or, lying is wrong. And then you're a babysitter and you have a young child upstairs, and the killer comes to the door and says, I'm in the mood to slaughter a baby. Do you have one in this house? And if you say, well, lying is wrong, therefore a second door on the right, that is dicto simpliciter, you see. Now, I may say that this is a very vaguely formulated fallacy. To say you said something too simply or too easily does not really put the finger on any particular fallacy. And I think that in the great majority of cases it would be a better explanation of the actual error in the reasoning if you said that what the person did is drop context intellectually. He forgets within what framework did he establish the generalization to begin with, which would dictate the conditions under which it holds. For instance, you first learn that lying is wrong, if you learn it in a rational way, in the context of the attempt to gain a value by fraud. And if you remembered that, then when the issue of using lying in defense, self-defense, as against gaining a value fraudulently, if that issue came up, the context in which you initially validated it would immediately remind you, and you wouldn't fall into this flaw. The trouble with saying that the essence of the fallacy is that it's oversimplified generalization is that many students draw the conclusion that in order to avoid this fallacy, you have to qualify every sentence that you utter to death. That you have to stick every conceivable qualification into the generalization anytime you utter it. And that is not possible and in fact not necessary. The real advice here is remember the original context in which the general statement was formulated and validated. And if you do that, you will not commit this fallacy, which in essence is to take a generalization formulated in one context, pull it out of its context, treat it as a floating absolute, and then apply it to a particular case with bizarre consequence. But since it's standard to call it oversimplified generalization or dicto simpliciter, we'll continue to call it that. All right, now let's make a start on the modern type of induction. This is a type formulated only after the Renaissance. It is the type which employs the method of experimentation, and therefore it is frequently called experimental induction and equally frequently called scientific induction. It too, of course, is genuine induction as against complete enumeration, but it is not an induction which rests upon enumeration of instances. It operates in a very different way. Now, before we formally go into what this is, it might be helpful to have an example in advance of the difference between induction by simple enumeration and an experimental induction on the same subject matter, so you can just keep that in mind. And suppose we take the scurvy case, if you're doing this by simple enumeration, you just simply passively walk around. And you say, there's somebody that has scurvy, and sure enough, he didn't have fresh fruits. You mark down case 1, and you find it in case 2 and case 3, and after a while you say, therefore, whenever there's no fresh fruit, that will lead to scurvy. That is induction simply by enumeration. Now, what would be an essentially different approach? You'd say to yourself, well, what conceivable factors would be relevant to cause scurvy? You'd list some hypothesis. And you'd say, is the absence of fresh fruit the only factor that is involved in the production of scurvy? Well, let's try an experiment. Supposing we can't do it on human beings let us call it for short, humanitarian reasons. We'll try an experiment on appropriate animals. We'll get 2 groups, try to keep all factors in common. Give the same diet, everything the same, except in one case we'll withhold the fresh fruit and whatever else is involved. In the other case we won't. And then if we see one group gets scurvy and one doesn't, and if we have controlled the situation properly, we have a very strong basis, if we've done it properly, to generalize and come to the conclusion that the absence of fresh fruit causes scurvy. We're still going from some instances to all, but now if we control our factors properly, we can do it on a comparatively few instances. So the essence of this experimental approach is not simply to accumulate instances, but rather to subject the data to a causal analysis. The principle of this approach is try to find a causal connection between the 2 items you're trying to link in your generalization. Try to find a causal connection and do so on the basis of simply a few instances. You don't need a great many if you have the right technique for finding a causal connection. And once you have established a causal connection between S and P, you can then generalize right away and say all S is P and be sure of it because you know that S is the cause of P. Now this type of induction, I've told you it's called experimental induction and scientific induction. It is also called eliminative induction. Eliminative induction. And in that sense it's contrasted with the other type, which is therefore sometimes simply called enumerative induction. In enumerative induction, you simply enumerate instances. This type is called eliminative induction because the essence of an experiment, as we'll see, is that you attempt to eliminate all possible factors that could be the cause of a given effect but one. And then when you've established its causal connection to the thing, the predicate in question, you can generalize safely. Therefore, the idea is we're going to try to validate generalizations by establishing causal connections through experimental methods. Now you may say, well, why do you need any experimental method in order to establish causal connections? Why can't you just observe, and if you see that one thing comes right after another, conclude? Therefore, the first was the cause of the second. Why can't you simply argue like this? B comes after A in time, therefore B comes because of A. A is the cause. That is invalid reasoning, so here is number 3. And it has a nice Latin title, and it is known by its Latin title. The fallacy called post hoc ergo propter hoc. Post, P-O-S-T. Hoc, H-O-C. Ergo, E-R-G-O. Propter, P-R-O-P-T-E-R. And hoc again, H-O-C. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, which means literally, after this, therefore, because of this. Propter means because. After this, therefore, because of this. Now, what this fallacy calls attention to is that it is an error to confuse temporal connection with causal connection. You cannot assume that because 2 events are connected in time, one of them comes right after the other. Therefore, they are connected by a causal relation. One of them occurs because of the other. You cannot assume that. It does not always hold. Two events can be connected temporally simply by coincidence, without there being any causal relation. If you argue, this event came after this one, therefore because of this one, that's post hoc ergo propter hoc, or to its friends you simply call it post hoc. Now again, a great many superstitions are based on post hoc. You walk under a ladder and then you have bad luck, and you say therefore walking under the ladder caused bad luck. After this, therefore because of this. Or take this simple example. Of course it didn't rain today because I carried my raincoat. That's post hoc. It didn't rain after I carried my raincoat, therefore it didn't rain because I carried my raincoat. It's confusing temporal relation with a causal relation. In other words, then we do need to establish a definite methodology by which to validate a causal connection. You cannot simply assume temporal sequence is sufficient. Well, if we need a methodology to establish causal connections, we must first have a definition of the causal relationship. What is a cause? We have to know what it is before we can work out a methodology of finding it. Now, from this point, I am following John Stuart Mill's account of the definition of cause, and I'll explain his reasons for this definition as we go. Well, Mill looked around in effect and made a list of the different usages in English of the term cause. And there are a variety of usages. But he singled out three, or at least to be more accurate, I'm singling out three that he singled out. To call to your attention, two of them we're going to get rid of, and then the third will be the actual use. Now, one use of the term cause in English equates cause with what is called necessary condition. Necessary condition. Now, by necessary condition in this connection, we mean a condition which must be present to yield a certain effect, but which is not itself enough to produce that effect. A condition which must be present to produce a certain effect, but which is not itself enough to produce that effect. It is necessary, but not sufficient, in other words. Now, for example, you can say, if we take the case of revolution that we worked on last time, political revolution, a popular political revolution, you can say dissatisfaction is the cause of revolution. And that is a perfectly reputable meaning of the term, use of the term cause. But in this usage, obviously you mean by cause, it is a necessary condition. You're not yet saying it is also a sufficient condition. Because obviously you can have widespread popular discontent with a government and not have a revolution. You also need at least a minimal freedom so that the proponents of revolution can get together, and you need some courageous leaders and so on. So you would say that dissatisfaction is a necessary condition of revolution. And therefore that is really part of what we mean by cause, and sometimes you use it simply synonymously with cause. But if you think about it, you see that that is not the full meaning of cause. Otherwise we'd have to say, for instance, oxygen is the cause of a forest fire. Since oxygen is a necessary condition, but you wouldn't use the term that way. Therefore, Mill rejected necessary conditions as the appropriate definition of cause. Well, the second thing that we can consider is defining cause simply as sufficient condition. Now, a sufficient condition is a condition which need not be present to get a certain effect. But when it is, it will produce the effect. It is enough. It is sufficient to produce the effect, even though it's not necessary. Now again, in this usage, the term is very common. The word cause is commonly used as sufficient but not necessary condition. For instance, what is the cause of death? And the coroner answers arsenic. Now you can say arsenic is the cause of death. There, arsenic is in a certain quantity and so on, is obviously sufficient to produce death, but it is not necessary. You could have death by drowning and stabbing, and I leave it to your imagination. What is the cause of crop failure? Well, a person might say Plague of locusts is the cause. But obviously, that is sufficient, but not necessary. You could have a crop failure through drought or excessive rain or whatever. Now, although therefore there is this widespread tendency in English to use cause as meaning sufficient, but not necessary condition, Mill, and I may say Aristotle also, denied that this use of cause was really valid. They denied that this is the real meaning of the concept of cause. Because if you use the term cause in this way, you run up against what is called the plurality of causes. Plurality, P-L-U-R-A-L-I-T-Y, plurality of causes. Plurality of causes is the theory that there can be more than one cause for the identical effect. That there can be a number of different causes producing the same effect. Now, both Aristotle and Mill held that this is philosophically invalid. That there cannot be more than one cause producing the identical effect. And this is one of the few cases where the Aristotelian tradition and the followers of John Stuart Mill agree on something, I may say. But their argument, in essence, amounts to this. If you take any case where it appears that there is a plurality of causes, that is, a variety of different causes which lead to the same effect, you will find, if you analyze the cases properly, that in fact that is not so. Now, for instance, take the case where it seems like arsenic could cause death, or stabbing could cause death, or drowning could cause death, and therefore radically different causes could produce the identical effect. The whole philosophic tradition here would argue it is not really the identical effect. If you look at the corpse through arsenic, and you count that as the effect, that is perceptibly different than the corpse through drowning or the corpse through stabbing, etc. And therefore, if you take the effect specifically, in its concrete reality, there is a one-to-one correlation between a type of death and a type of cause. And the illusion that there is a plurality of causes comes from the fact that you are specifying the cause, but not specifying the effect. You're treating cause and effect on non-equivalent levels of abstraction, treating the cause narrowly and the effect broadly. Whereas they argue if you define the effect specifically enough, there will always be a one-to-one correlation between cause and effect. Either by specifying the effect, as I say, or another possible way of showing it is to show that when it seems that you have a number of different causes, there really is a common denominator linking them all. And therefore there really only is one cause after all. Now, for instance, you might say the effect is fear. And couldn't there be a whole bunch of different causes? For instance, you have to take an exam. Or the doctor tells you you have an illness. Or the stock market suddenly crashes. And in all cases you feel fear. Now, isn't that different causes leading to the same effect? Now, on that type of example, you could certainly argue those allegedly different causes are simply different vehicles of the same one cause which is common to them all, namely, some perceived major threat to your values. And that's the common denominator, which stands in a one-to-one relationship with fear. Whenever you have that, you'll have fear and vice versa. So, in other words, the general argument is, if you either specify the effect or construe the cause broadly enough, but in other words, you get the two to match in level on which you take it, there will always be a one-to-one relation between cause and effect. And therefore, it is invalid to adopt the theory of plurality of causes. There's only one cause to one effect and vice versa. Now, Mill's whole subsequent discussion of experimentation rests on this view. And therefore he is not prepared to define cause as simply sufficient condition, because that would lead into the theory of plurality of causes. From this type of analysis, therefore, we reach the third definition, which is the one that Mill accepts and on which his methods are based. And that is cause as meaning necessary and sufficient condition. Necessary and sufficient condition. In other words, in this usage, for something to qualify as a cause, it must have two characteristics. It must first be necessary to the effect. In other words, you cannot have the effect without it. And second, it must be sufficient. so that if you have it, that is all that is required to produce the effect. Now, by this usage of cause, there is an exact one-to-one correlation. Wherever you have a given cause, you can infer that its effect must take place, and wherever you have a given effect, you can infer that only one particular cause must have caused. You can reason from cause to effect or from effect to cause. Same cause, same effect. Same effect, same cause. And that is the concept of causality on which Mill's methods are based. As an example, for instance, if the effect in question were combustion, then you'd formulate the cause something like this: the placing of the material above kindling temperature in the presence of oxygen. That is necessary, let us say, for combustion, and sufficient for combustion. And therefore that would be a necessary and sufficient condition. That would be a cause. Now we are ready to formulate, given this concept of causality, the methods by which we can arrive at and validate our claims that we have discovered causal laws. Mill defined 5 of these methods, and guess what these methods of discovering and validating causal laws are called? They are methods originated, or if not originated, at least most influentially formulated by Mill, and they have received, therefore, the name Mill's methods. Now, I say he formulated 5 of them. One of the ones that he formulated, however, is simply using 2 of the others at the same time. It's a joint method, so-called, which introduces nothing new, and it's pointless, therefore, to treat it as a separate method, because you can use any combination of these methods in different cases, so we will only regard 4 of his methods, the 4 which have some distinction. Those methods are called the method of agreement, spelled just like it sounds, the method of difference, E-N-C-E, difference, the method of concomitant variations, C-O-N, C-O-M-I-T-A-N-T, concomitant variations, and finally the method of residues, R-E-S-I-D-U-E-S. Now we'll take our break here before we start these methods, and for the second half, please have the booklet opened at page 17, because I have 3 of these methods symbolized and we'll be referring to. All right, let us begin with method number 1, the method of agreement. And I think I will begin by simply dictating to you a long definition, which I will subsequently translate into intelligible English. If, comma, that's a punctuation mark. If, comma, in 2 or more cases where an effect occurs, comma, one and only one of the antecedent factors is common to all of the collections of antecedents, comma. Then that factor is the cause dash or an indispensable part of the cause, period. To repeat, if in 2 or more cases where an effect occurs, one and only one of the antecedent factors is common to all of the collections of antecedents, then that factor is the cause or an indispensable part of the cause. Now, to put that into simpler language, you have several cases which agree in that in all those cases the effect takes place. It occurs, the same effect. They agree in the effect. And since the whole thing is based on the premise that there's a one-to-one correlation between the effect and the cause, if in a number of cases there is agreement in the same effect, you infer there must be agreement on some factor which is the cause. If there's only one factor common to all the cases, then that must be the cause. In other words, the idea of the reasoning is agreement in effect requires agreement in cause. If these cases agree that the effect is the same in each case, then there must be some factor which they agree upon as the cause, and if you find that one factor and only one, that's the cause. That's why it's called the method of agreement. As a symbolic statement of this method, you can look on page 17 at the bottom there under the heading for lecture 9, number 1, agreement, and this is the typical way these are symbolized. We have it abstractly, let us say case 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're using only 4 cases. You could have only 2 cases for agreement, and you could have 2 dozen, doesn't make any difference. Well, I chose 4. That's the case, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, antecedent factors means any factor which occurred prior to the effect and which you hypothesize might conceivably be relevant to the effect. So before you apply this method, you say to yourself, what could possibly be the cause? Well, suppose you say symbolically. It might be A, it might be B, C, D, etc. Suppose you get up to H and that's all. So you symbolize. In case 1, I noticed A, B, and C was present, but D, E, F was not. So I leave those out. H was present. I don't know why I ignored G here altogether, but assume that it wasn't present in any of them. And in case 2, A, B, D was present. C wasn't, but D was. And H was present, and so on for 3 and 4 with their relevant things. And then, under the column named effect, we simply put E. E means, obviously, the effect occurred. Now, this method tells us, if you have a situation such as this, the E's all agree. The effect occurred in each case. Therefore, we look under the antecedent factors that we hypothesize, and we know from the definition of cause that there must be at least one factor that is common to all cases, because they agree in the effect. And we look here and we see it's H, not anything else. All those others are present in some cases and absent in others, but H is the one and only one factor that's present in all cases. It's the only area of agreement, and therefore you infer H must be the cause of E. That, in essence, is the method of agreement. Now, for instance, this method was used to discover the properties of fluoridating water supply in connection with the lessening of tooth decay. And they observed that in several communities had the same effect, namely much less tooth decay than the norm. And they hypothesized what could be the cause. And they listed a whole bunch of factors. The amount of food that people eat, the nature of the diet, how much sugar, etc. Maybe the genetic structure of the people, the climate, the exact location, etc. And one thing was the structure of the water supply. And they symbolized those appropriately. It doesn't make any difference whether you symbolize it or not. And they went around checking. And they found that the amount of food varied enormously from person to person or community to community, and the nature of the diet and so on. And the only one thing which was common to them all was the water supply happened to be naturally fluoridated. And consequently they inferred agreement in effect means agreement in cause must entail that. This is the one factor in which they agree. Consequently, this is the cause. A still simpler example. You go with a number of friends to an amusement park. And in the evening you all have a stomachache. You agree in the effect. So you try and think, well, what could conceivably be the cause? So you have to hypothesize what could be the cause to get this method off the ground. But you say, let us say for simplicity, well, might be cotton candy, it might be lemonade that we had, it might be the roller coaster, it might be the tunnel of love, etc. Whatever you can think of. And then you check and you see, well, in case 1 didn't have cotton candy, in case 2 didn't go on the roller coaster, in case 3 didn't go on the tunnel of love, but everybody had lemonade. And let's suppose that's the one common factor. Then you would say, other things being equal, assuming your hypotheses are okay to begin with, the lemonade is the cause of the stomachache. That would be the method of agreement. Now, how does this method work? It works by elimination. All of these methods work by elimination. What they do is eliminate all possible candidates for the cause except one. And then you simply say, this is the only one that isn't eliminated. Something must have been the cause, so this must be it. How does it eliminate? Well, if you look at the chart, consider the chart that we have on page 17 here. Consider case 1, factor A. Now, how could we reason that A could not have been the cause of E from this information? Well, you'd look down and you'd say, well, A is present in case 2, so that doesn't eliminate it. A is present in case 3, that doesn't. And then you look to case 4 and you see what? There is no A, and nevertheless you had the effect. Now you know, granted the concept of causality we're working with, wherever you have the effect, you must have the cause. So if there's a case where A doesn't occur, and nevertheless the effect does, that's eliminated. It can't be the cause. And by equivalent reasoning, we eliminate B because it doesn't occur in case 3. We eliminate D, and we eliminate E and F, and the only one we can't eliminate is H. In other words, our reasoning is you can't have the effect in the absence of a cause. And in this case, every one of those, with the exception of H, is absent in some case. Therefore, it must be eliminated. Now, you can use this method, you see, either simply to eliminate. Somebody says A is the cause of this effect, and you want to show him that it isn't the cause, without even going on to establish what is the cause. In which case, you're using this method simply negatively, to eliminate A. In which case, the rule of elimination, which this method uses, is the following. Nothing can be the cause of X, where X is the effect. Nothing can be the cause of X, in the absence of which X occurs. Nothing can be the cause of X, in the absence of which X occurs. That's the principle of elimination used by the method of agreement. A can't be the cause because the effect occurs in its absence in case 4. D can't be the cause because the effect occurs in its absence in case 1, 3, and 4, etc. So the general rule of elimination that this method uses is nothing can be the cause of a given effect X, in the absence of which X nevertheless occurs. And you therefore use this method to eliminate those candidates. Sometimes you simply use the method to eliminate. But sometimes, as in the case that we have actually symbolized here in the booklet, you can go on, having eliminated everything else, to say this is the only thing left which we can't eliminate, therefore it must be the cause. But you really identify the correct cause only by a process of elimination, of having eliminated everything else. Your reasoning is, in essence, the cause must be either A or B or C or D. Suppose we stop just with those 4. That's premise 1. The cause is either A or B or C or D. Premise 2. It's not A, and it's not B, and it's not C. Conclusion, therefore, it must be D. Now that, you see, is simply a very complex alternative argument. It's a deductive argument in its structure. Remember an alternative argument, either P or Q, not P, therefore Q. Well, it's the same type of reasoning, only you put forth a number of alternatives. You say the cause is A or B or C or D or however many there are. Now, where does the induction come in here? Where does Mill's method come in? It does not give you your first premise. It does not tell you what are the possible causes. All it does is give you the means to eliminate all but one of those by the method of agreement, and the other method will give you other means of elimination. So Mill's method gives you only the second premise. It's not A, it's not B, it's not C. And then, of course, your conclusion just follows deductively from those premises. So the reasoning is, to summarize this, in this method, same effect, we must have the same cause. If there's only one factor that's the same, that must be the cause. Everything else is eliminated. Now you might ask, what if two factors are the same? What if A and B are both common to every case? And that's the total of your information. Then there's three possibilities. One, that the cause is A and B is simply a coincidence. Two, that the cause is B and A is simply a coincidence. Three, that the cause is the combination of A and B, and that it wouldn't occur without either of them. And you'd have to do further experimentation to establish which of those it was. Now, why do we put in the formulation of the method of agreement that it's the cause or an indispensable part of the cause? And this is because you may have, in hypothesizing the factors that go in the chart, you may have omitted a necessary condition. You may have thought you got the whole works, but in fact you may have omitted a necessary condition, and therefore ended up not with the cause, but only with an indispensable part of the cause. So, for instance, if you had been surveying revolutions, and you had had the American Revolution, the French, and several others, and you listed all the factors, and you hypothesized dissatisfaction, and that was the only one on your chart, and you conclude dissatisfaction is the cause, you're using Mill's method, but because you didn't include the other necessary conditions of revolution in your original hypotheses, they don't occur in your conclusion, and you don't have the full cause for the reasons I mentioned earlier in the lecture. You have only got a part of the cause. So we put for an indispensable part of the cause to cover that. Now, this is important because it means that even if something fulfills Mill's method, you cannot immediately assert a general causal law, because there may be other necessary factors involved that have not yet been distinguished by you. Now, the use of this method is obviously straightforward. The big question, of course, is how do you arrive at the factors, at the possible candidates for cause? Well, you might say, list every factor. List every single factor involved, and then you'll find the one alone that's common. Unfortunately, this cannot be done. If for no other reason, you would die of old age before you finish one example. If you take that fluoridation example, there are endless, millions, an unlimited number of factors that are that you could consider if your idea is list every single factor. For instance, how many times do they go to church? What kind of ties they wear? How many wear polka dot and stripes, etc.? What's their philosophy? What's the length of their toenails? I mean, you can go on indefinitely. So you obviously say to yourself, well, I'm not going to list every factor. I'm going to list only relevant factors. But then the question is, what determines when a factor is relevant? How do you know when a factor is a potential cause that has to be watched for and when you can safely dismiss it? Now, Mill's methods do not answer this question. You must make your hypotheses by some method other than the Mill's method. And obviously, in a great many cases, this requires enormous creativity. You couldn't, for instance, say, I'm going to take the weekend off and discover the cure for cancer by the method of agreement. I'll just list all cases that have cancer and whip off the factors they have in common, because you wouldn't know where to begin. You'd have to have a great deal of knowledge. Now, here is the point where generalization intersects with theory formation or hypothesis formation. And this is where, for a full theory of induction, you would have to state the epistemological rule that a scientist or a human being would have to follow in order to warrant a causal hypothesis. When can he say such and such is a possibility that must be watched for, such and such is not a possibility and can be altogether discounted? You need a theory of scientific theory formation as a supplement to Mill's methods before you would have a full answer. In the absence of that, all you can say about Mill's methods is the more you know about the subject matter, the better the chances that your hypotheses will be decent. But Mill himself does not tell you. Now, restricting ourselves simply to Mill's methods, and specifically agreement, let us now identify 3 sources of error that you can commit in using this, and these same 3 will be 3 general fallacies that are applicable in using any of Mill's methods. So on our list of 7, you can call them 4, 5, and 6. We will apply these, though, only to cases where you are trying to use Mill's methods. So this is number 4 now, is that right? It's called the fallacy of emphasizing irrelevant factors. And that is just what it sounds like. The method breaks down altogether if you do not include the relevant causal factor in the net of factors that you study. For instance, we had the example if you have a stomachache at the circus. Suppose you forgot to hypothesize the lemonade, and you found that everybody did have hot dogs. And you worked out Mill's method, and you followed every step brilliantly, only you'd come up with the conclusion then that the hot dog was the cause of the stomachache, and not the lemonade, because you got a coincidence. Now, the method has no guarantee against that. You must have somewhere in your hypothesis the right factor. If you don't, then you can be trapped by a coincidence. And the only advice that the method gives you is make use of whatever knowledge you already have and cast your net as widely as you can. Consider too many factors if you have to err rather than too few, in the hopes that the real cause will have snuck in. But obviously, again, that's very generalized. But in any event, one fallacy is emphasizing irrelevant factors. Now, another fallacy, this would be number 5, is confusing a necessary condition with a cause. Confusing a necessary condition with the cause. And that is the fallacy we already mentioned. That's why we put in, or an indispensable part of the cause. If you say, for instance, the cause of evolution is dissatisfaction, you are using the method and thinking you're arriving at the full cause when in fact you're only arriving at a necessary condition. Now here the method gives you a certain advice to avoid this. If you ever want to check is something a necessary condition or the full cause, see if the effect will occur with only the factor in question. And if only that factor is required, then of course that factor is the full cause. If it won't, then you suspect that it's simply a necessary condition and something else is required. That's a second error that you can make in applying this method. And the third, which is therefore number 6 on our list, the fallacy of improper analysis. The fallacy of improper analysis. It may be the case that you really do have the real causal factor in your chart. And therefore, you don't have irrelevant factors. You're not confusing a necessary condition with the cause. You did find the cause, but you did not analyze it properly. For instance, suppose lemonade was really the cause. You obviously would have to subject that to some kind of analysis. If you simply said, the cause is lemonade, therefore, I hereby put forth the following generalization. Lemonade causes stomach aches. You have not properly analyzed it. You had the cause, but you didn't analyze it correctly. Obviously, it would be something in the lemonade. And the real causal connection would be that it's X factor carried by the lemonade, which is the cause, not simply lemonade as such. And therefore, you must subject the factor that you have put down to the appropriate analysis, otherwise you will be led to false generalization. Now, the classic example of this, just an example, is the so-called fallacy of the scientific drinker, who tries to use the method of agreement. He has a hangover every day. The cases agree in the effect, so he attempts to use the method of agreement, and he puts down case 1 on Monday, bourbon and soda. Case 2, scotch and soda. Case 3, rye and soda. You get the idea? And then by the method of agreement, he concludes that soda is the cause of his hangover. Now there you see, he had the factor on the chart. It wasn't irrelevant factors. But he analyzed it improperly. And there again, all the method will tell you is subject it to further tests. Before you say lemonade is the cause of stomachache, drink some lemonade and see. And if you can have the effect without the cause, then of course you've eliminated lemonade, so you know it must be something in the lemonade. Those three fallacies are applicable to all of Mill's method. Again, I might mention, it is worth looking for negative instances on the ground that one exception disproves the rule, as we have discussed. All right, let's look at the method of difference. Once you get the idea of these methods, they don't vary that profoundly, so we don't have to spend that long on each. Here again, I'll dictate a long definition. If a case in which an effect occurs, comma, and one in which it does not occur, comma, are alike in all relevant respects, except for the presence or absence of a single factor, comma, the effect occurring when that factor is present, comma, and not occurring when it is absent, comma. Then that factor is the cause, dash. Or an indispensable part of the cause. If a case in which an effect occurs and one in which it does not occur are alike in all relevant respects, except for the presence or absence of a single factor, the effect occurring when that factor is present and not occurring when it is absent, then that factor is the cause or an indispensable part of the cause. Now, again, the idea here is simple. You have two cases only when you have the method of difference. They differ in the effect. In one case, the effect occurs. If you look at the chart, you symbolize it by E. The other case, the effect does not occur. Symbolize it by non-E. And your reasoning is like this. They differ in effect. If there's a difference in effect, there must be a difference somewhere that accounts for it. So you hypothesize the antecedent factors. If they're all the same but for one, which is the only difference, then it must be the difference that caused the difference. Difference in effect must be difference in cause. If there's only one factor which is different, it must be the cause. So in the symbols that we have for number 2 there, you see that they're identical in A, B, C, D, E. F must be the factor that makes the difference. So you would conclude, assuming everything else is okay, F is the cause of E. Now, this is obviously the method widely used by scientists. For instance, you want to test whether vaccinating an animal produces immunity. So you get two groups, for instance, of cows. I don't know why I pick on cows, but just as an example. Now, to use this method, they have to be the same in all relevant respects. So you have to already hypothesize what could conceivably affect their immunity. So you'd get, for instance, cows of the same age, the same general health. You don't want one group that's all broken down and the other bursting with health because that'll wreck your control. Same kind of diet. You don't feed one caviar and the other grass. Same living conditions, the same stock, etc., etc. Whatever you think might conceivably be relevant to their susceptibility to immunity. And the only difference is You vaccinate one and not the other, and then if one comes up with the disease and the other doesn't, you say, well, the vaccination was the difference that made the difference, and therefore the serum was the cause of the immunity. Here again, as with the method of agreement, you operate by elimination. The reasoning is a difference of effect, there must be a difference of cause, and in the case we have here, for instance, on the sheet, A is the same in both cases, therefore A could not be the cause. It could not be the cause because in case 2 we have the effect we do not have the effect, but nevertheless we have A. And since we know that wherever you have the cause you must have the effect, we can eliminate A and also B, C, D. Now, by the way, when you use the method of difference, you do not eliminate A, B, C, and D, in this example, as necessary conditions. For all you know from this information, A may be a necessary condition, without which the effect will not occur. Difference does not eliminate these other factors as necessary conditions. To eliminate them altogether as even as necessary conditions, you'd have to have a case where the effect occurs without them. You'd have to supplement difference by agreement. But what this does show us is that these factors at least can't be the complete cause, and that F must be at least an essential factor in the cause. The rule of elimination here is just the reverse of the rule in connection with agreement. Remember we said the elimination rule under agreement was nothing can be the cause of X in the absence of which X occurs. Well, the rule under difference is, if you want to take this down, this is the rule of elimination that's used in difference. Nothing can be the cause of X in the presence of which X does not occur. Nothing can be the cause of X in the presence of which X does not occur. In other words, the reasoning here is, if you have a case where a certain factor is present, but the effect does not occur, that eliminates, on the grounds that there must be a one-to-one correlation between them. That is not the same as the method of agreement. Agreement says, here we do have the effect. Without this factor can't be the cause. Here we say we have the factor and don't have the effect. Therefore, this factor can't be the cause. In other words, a difference of effect presupposes a difference of cause. So you can use this method like the other, either simply to eliminate a candidate, or if you find there's only one factor difference, that one by elimination must be the correct cause. What would you do if there were 2 factors different, say A and B, which were both present when the effect was present and absent when it was absent? You'd say the cause is either A or B, or A and B, and you'd have to do further experimentation. Again, we say, or an indispensable part of the cause, because you may have isolated a necessary condition only. For instance, a simple example. Your cigarette lighter stops working. You put a new flint in, and it starts working. The only difference between the 2 cases is the flint. So if you drew the conclusion, therefore, the cause of it working is the flint, whenever there's a flint it will work, you would obviously have gone wrong by confusing a necessary condition with the cause. In this case, one of the factors that was constant, for instance, the fluid or the wick or whichever, was also necessary to get the effect of it working. So we put in an indispensable part of the cause so as to cover the possibility that you're confusing the necessary condition with the cause. Here again, the same warnings are necessary as with regard to agreement. It's crucial what factors you hypothesize. If you don't hypothesize the right factors, the method is useless. For instance, you go to watch a magician, and you see that first there's an empty hat. Then he says presto. And then there's a rabbit. You say, well, the only difference was presto. Therefore, by the method of difference, that must be the cause. Obviously, you have missed a crucial factor, namely the sleight of hand involved. And you've used the method of difference to get you something which has no causal significance at all. So the method will not save you from that. It will simply tell you if you have the relevant factors, then if there's only one, that's it. And again, of course, you must properly analyze the factors. Fallacy of improper analysis is always possible. You might use the method of difference to conclude that it was oysters that caused you to have, I don't know, a stomachache, to use that example again. You had dinner 2 consecutive nights, everything else was the same. One night you had oysters and the other you didn't, but you have to then analyze, is it oysters as such, or something in the oysters, or the oysters were bad, or what is it? You can't simply draw the general law, all oysters are stomachache causers, unless you analyze it properly. So all those same fallacies are applicable. This is really a much better method than the method of agreement, in the respect that this is the experimental method par excellence. In the method of agreement, the scientist or the person who uses it is essentially passive. He simply has to wait until he's confronted with a number of cases where the effect occurs, and then try to abstract the common denominator. But in the case of the method of difference, he can actively intervene and manipulate the variables. He can set up a controlled situation where he deliberately focuses attention on the one variable he wants to determine the causal significance of. He'll hold everything constant and simply change one factor and see what effect it has, and then change another and see what effect it has. And therefore, you have infinitely more power with the method of difference than you do with the method of agreement. Although, as I indicated, they're very helpful to mutually supplement each other. All right, let us look briefly at concomitant variations, which is spelled on page 17, and which I spelled already. Concomitant just means together, corresponding. And I'll dictate you a definition. If a certain factor alone varies concomitantly with the variations in the effect, comma, then that factor is the cause of the variations in the effect, dash, or an indispensable part of the cause. If a certain factor alone varies concomitantly with the variations in the effect, comma, then that factor is the cause of the variations in the effect or an indispensable part of the cause. Here the idea is you have an effect which varies in quantity, varies in amount, varies in degree. It might go up or down. You hypothesize your antecedent factors, and if you find there's only one that varies together with, concomitantly, corresponding to the variations in the effect, you say that factor must be the cause. The symbolization of this is given in number 3 at the very bottom of page 17. Again, you could have any number of cases, and you can quantify it precisely, but for our purposes, I just use plus and minus. So suppose E is the effect, and B, C, D remain constant, and A is the factor in question, and we use just A for the normal amount, the standard amount. And then let's say E takes a big jump in the next case in quantity. And we notice that A took a big jump. And then E goes way, way up. So we symbolize that crudely by E double plus. And A goes way, way up. And then E goes way below normal, E minus, and A goes below normal. Now those two are said to vary concomitantly. As one goes up, the other goes up, and so on. Now with this data, you would conclude by the method of concomitant variations that A is the cause of E. Now a typical example of this would be, for instance, the law in science that if you keep the pressure constant, the temperature of a gas and its volume vary concomitantly. Changes in the temperature, as the temperature goes up, the volume, the effect, will go up. As the temperature goes down, the volume will go down. That is a law established by concomitant variation. Now, in ordinary life, the nature of the variations does not have to necessarily be exact, because there may be many factors operating that you can't identify, which prevent you from having a literal mathematical variation. But if, in essence, two factors vary, you still count that as concomitant variations. For instance, you put an ad in a newspaper selling some product, and you have a little coupon that the person is to send back to you if he's interested in your product. Now, let's suppose you keep the copy the same week after week, and you use the same outlets. You don't publish in the Podunk Daily one day and the New York Daily News the other, because that would ruin it. But you keep the same outlets, same copy, same day of the week. Keep everything else constant, let us say, that's relevant. But you vary only the size of the ad. You will find, although it's not an exact correlation, that if the ad is much bigger, other things being equal, the chances are the response will be much bigger. And if the ad is very tiny, the response will be comparatively less. It won't be an exact correlation the way the temperature volume case was, because there are certain factors that you can't here specify, the chance of who happens to see the ad and so on. But in a certain approximate range, you will establish a causal connection by concomitant variation. Then again, a concomitant variation may hold only within certain limits. Obviously, for instance, there's a certain smallness beneath which, if the ad gets, it can't be seen anyway, so that's going to cut it off at that end. And on the other hand, suppose you took the front page of the Times in its entirety for your ad, assuming you could get it. Taking the back page isn't going to help much either. And consequently, it'll hit an upper limit also, and that's very common in concomitant variations, that they hold only within limits. Now, we have so far been talking only about concomitant variations which are direct. That is, both factors operate in the same direction. When the cause goes up, the effect goes up. When the cause goes down, the effect goes down. That's known as a direct concomitant variation. There's also cases of concomitant variation where they move in opposite directions. The cause goes up, the effect goes down. The cause goes down, the effect goes up. And that type of relation is known as an inverse concomitant variation. So, for instance, if you keep the temperature of a gas constant, as the volume increases, the pressure decreases, and vice versa. Or in economics, if you keep the demand constant, as the supply increases, the price decreases. That's an inverse concomitant variation. Or if you take a wire or a string that you are plucking and getting a pitch, a sound out of it, the longer the length of the string, in other words, the bigger, the lower is going to be the pitch of the note that comes out. That is an inverse concomitant variation. And there are many, many examples of that. Now, concomitant variations as a method, whether direct or inverse, does not really introduce any new methodological principle. As you can see if you look at the diagram, it is really simply a successive application of the method of difference. Because you're really arguing like this, if you look at the diagram on page 17. What is the difference between 1 and 2? The only difference is the change from A to A plus. And what is the difference between 2 and 3? The change from the plus to the double plus, etc. So it's like a quick successive application of the method of difference and does not really introduce any new principles. It is, however, a very valuable method properly applied. It is a very valuable method, in its own way more valuable than the method of difference. For one reason, you can use it in cases where difference is impossible to use. If you wanted, for instance, to establish the relationship between the length of the string I just mentioned and the pitch by difference, that would be impossible, because you'd have to have one case where the string was present and one case where it was absent. But here you can do it by degrees, you see. Or if you wanted to establish the relationship between the moon's relation to the earth and the height of the tides, by difference you'd have to have one case where the moon is there and one case where it isn't. But you couldn't do that. But by concomitant variations, you can do it by degrees. As the moon gets closer, the tides get higher, etc. But the real value of concomitant variations is that it permits you to formulate mathematical laws, quantitatively specified laws. Because in a great many cases you can give an exact mathematical formulation of what variation in the cause will produce what variation in the effect. And that, of course, is an enormous value in the precision of knowledge in those cases where it is applicable. You can make a kind of precise prediction and have a kind of precise control over nature that is impossible without the use of mathematics. Now, while therefore having kind words to say for this method, I would like to point out that it is vulnerable to the same three fallacies that the other methods are, for the same reasons. And in particular, I would like to stress to you that this method is highly subject to the fallacy of emphasizing irrelevant factors. You can find the weirdest concomitant variations which are simply coincidental, which prove nothing, and nevertheless which exist. Now, someone told me once that for some long period of time, there was a direct concomitant variation between the number of semicolons on the editorial page of the Times in a given unit of time, and the number of people that died of famine in a certain province in India. And as the semicolons went up, the deaths went up, and vice versa. Now, there is a certain mentality who would say, well, fine, let's establish that's a statistical probability, and would then pick at the Times to reduce the number of semicolons on its page. That is a corrupt, invalid use of concomitant variations. Now, here's another example that one author gives. He doesn't believe this, but it's just to show you that you can definitely have concomitant variations which mean nothing. Quote, the height of the hemline of women's dresses is caused by general business conditions. You will find that dresses are short during periods of prosperity and long during depression. Thus, the 20s was the period of short dresses and prosperity. During the Depression of 1932, dresses were long. During World War II and in the post-war prosperity, they were short. The new look of long dresses came in with the recession of 1949. The stock market is reaching new highs in 1959. Dresses are beginning to shorten again, etc. Now, you see, that is ridiculous as a method of reasoning, but that is concomitant variation. Now, in this connection, I will say simply a word I've been asked several times. What do I think of statistics as a means of establishing causal laws? Now, most statistical conclusions are established by concomitant variation. And my short answer to that, which is all I'm giving, is that is not a valid method of establishing a causal relationship. Statistical correlations are at best a lead. They give you an indication of a possibility. That's all. You must then employ other methods if you are to establish that your statistical correlations actually indicate a causal law. And here again, if you ask me, what kind of knowledge would you require without attempting a thorough or even partial theory of induction at this moment, I would go back to the point I made in connection with simple enumeration. You have to have some reason that you could explain why in the nature of the entities involved this characteristic is applicable. You'd have to be able to show, given this kind of entity, this is why, at least on some level of explanation. If you can't do that, then you're just simply in the position of the semicolons and the famine in India, and it is simply worthless. Now, there are endless grants today given to scientists to simply choose any two factors at random and invest a fortune to establish statistical correlation via the method of concomitant variations. That is not a valid method. You must first you must supplement, you must establish or validate whatever leads you get by that method in the manner I indicated, if you are not to simply end up with the typical modern junk. Now, let's say a word about the least significant of these methods, residues, which I will give you in its traditional formulation. Subduct S-U-B-D-U-C-T, which means subtract. Subduct from any phenomenon. Such part as is known by previous inductions to be the effect of certain antecedents, comma, ENTS. And the residue of the phenomenon is the effect of the remaining antecedents, period. Subduct, or take away, from any phenomenon. Such part as is known by previous inductions to be the effect of certain antecedents, and the residue of the phenomenon is the effect of the remaining antecedents. Now, no diagram is necessary here, and I didn't therefore include one. It wouldn't be particularly helpful. Residues applies when you have a compound effect, an effect consisting of two or more parts. Suppose your effect consists of parts A, B, and C. And you hypothesize the relevant factors, and suppose you say they're L, M, and N, just for the heck of it. And then you realize that you have earlier established that L and M cause A and B. In other words, that part of the antecedent, you know from previous knowledge, cause part of the effect. You then conclude that what's left of the antecedent must cause what's left of the effect. The residue, the remainder of the antecedent, is the cause of the remainder of the effect. That's how it gets its name, residues. Now, the claim to fame of this method is the discovery of the planet Neptune, which, believe it or not, was done by the method of residues, via the orbit of Uranus, the planet next to it. And they had predicted that Uranus should have a certain orbit, which I wouldn't even attempt to diagram. But in any event, they had expected, on the basis of all the knowledge they already had, that it would go, say, this way. I'm making a kind of vaguely oval shape. And in fact, they found, I'm simplifying the science here, but it's irrelevant, that at a certain point there was a little wiggle in its orbit that they could not explain. So if the total effect is the motion of Uranus, they broke it up into two parts. The general contour of the curve, which they could explain by antecedents they already knew. Planets and heavenly bodies and so on already discovered. And then a little wiggle. And that was the residue of the phenomenon. That was what was left over that they couldn't explain. So they hypothesized some new factor must be present to account for this wiggle. And by the nature of the wiggle, they figured it has to be of a certain size and in a certain position. And then they subsequently found it and they said, Eureka, that was Neptune. That's the method of residues. In essence, it is, again, like the method of difference, because you're really saying, what is the difference? The Neptune is the difference that makes the difference in the orbit. But it's used on only one instance. You take where you have a compound effect, you simply break it up in your mind into the part already explained and the residue. And then you eliminate the causes that you know already explain the normal, and the residue of the antecedents must explain the rest. So you have a heavy enrollment one year. You have 10,000 people enroll in a college. 7,000 is normal. The residue is 3,000. So you'll look for the one factor that is present here that isn't. And if you see that, I don't know, it's the GI Bill, then you say the residue caused the residue, the 3,000. And here again, as with all of Mill's methods, you must have relevant factors, proper analysis, and you can't confuse a necessary condition with a cause. Now that concludes Mill's methods. There's one last fallacy I want to mention. Number 7 on the list, and that is the fallacy of reversing cause and effect. reversing cause and effect. You may, in fact, identify two factors which are causally related, but confuse the effect with the cause and vice versa. To reverse cause and effect means you think the effect is the cause, and the cause is the effect, and you got it backwards. You put the cart before the horse. A common phenomenon. So, for instance, you observe that people with a rugged physique live in a place that has a harsh climate. Now, before you rush in, you have to ask yourself which is cause and which is effect here. Is it the case that ordinary physiqued people moved to this place and they evolved into being very rugged in order to deal with the harsh climate? In which case, the climate is essentially the cause and their adaptation to it is the effect. Or were they rugged in advance? And that's why they dared to come here, whereas the less rugged tribes passed it by and settled in Washington, D.C. instead. So that the ruggedness made possible the adaptation to the climate. You see, you have to get the factors in the right order. Now, of course, the easiest way to avoid this fallacy is to see which comes first, because the cause always comes before the effect. Here's another example. An English writer noted that those among the English poor who had cows were the most industrious. So he argued that the way to make the others industrious was to give them cows. Well, that is a clear case of reversing cause and effect. It wasn't the cows that made them industrious, but their industry that made them acquire more cows. Now, sometimes I might mention you have a tricky situation. You have what is called reciprocal causation. Reciprocal causation. That's not a fallacy. That is a type of causation. Reciprocal causation is the form of causation that occurs when one factor, let us say A, produces an effect B, which then redounds on A to intensify it, which then redounds on B. So you have factors mutually influencing each other. And you get, a vicious circle. Or if you like the circle, you call it a virtuous circle. But the idea is the factors mutually reinforce each other, and in those situations it can be very tricky to say which is the cause and which is the effect because they both influence the other. For instance, people argue do low caliber movies, all current sexploitation movies, etc. Is that the cause and the debased public taste is the effect, or is the debased public taste the cause and the crummy movies are simply catering to it and they're the effect? And of course you can make a case that in a situation like this there's a spiral, there's a certain reciprocity. The movies debase the taste, which debases the movies, which debases the taste, and so on in a vicious circle. Here, you could make a case that the movies, insofar as they're ideological, are more fundamental, and that it's ideological factors which create the public taste. But I'm simply indicating that you can have complex circles. In certain cases, however, whole philosophies rest essentially upon the fallacy of reversing cause and effect. And here are the two archetypes whose whole views consist of the reversing cause and effect are Marx, who makes machinery the cause and ideas the effect, and the Freudians, who make your sex life the cause and in philosophy the effect. Their claim to fame is that they reverse cause and effect as a way of life. All right, that concludes what I want to say about induction, which gives us one topic left to cover, and that is the topic of analogies, which is simply an application of the general principles of inductive reasoning and of the rules of generalization to a specific type of argument, and that's going to be our general subject matter next week. For now, you are prepared to do all of the homework on induction in the booklet, and that homework begins on page 9. Now, in order to finish next week, we have got to cover next week the theory of analogy, which should take us a half hour or so, And then we'll have to take up, 8 analogies that are in the booklet, which we'll have to take up right there in class because I can't assign it for the next week since next week is the last time. So some of this homework I'm going to have to take up now, even though you haven't done it, but we'll do it together. What I will assign is only the section entitled Mill's Methods on page 9. And there are 10 examples, a couple of them made up, simplified versions, and some of them taken from real books. And all I ask you to do is read them, and they're simply for your edification. Examples of the use of Mill's methods. Just tell me which method is being used. That's all. We won't attempt to criticize these because to go into the science involved, we'd have to know the subject matter, but they're simply illustrations of the use of Mill's methods, either to identify a cause or at least to eliminate some candidate for cause. So all you have to do in those 10 is tell me which method it is. They're not necessarily good uses of Mill, but they're illustrative. Now, I'll stop for about 5 minutes now. In that time, I ask you to scan the 16 examples which start on page 11. Choose one of 7 fallacies. And I'll even give you a tip. There are none that are emphasizing irrelevant factors. So you're down to 6 possibilities. Hasty generalizing, dicto simpliciter, post hoc, improper analysis, confusing a necessary condition with a cause, and reversing cause and effect. Now, I'll give you about 5 minutes to look at those 16, and then I'd like to take those up tonight. And I understand we still have 11 definitions, if that's conceivable. I'm going to try to work some of those in too, till we run out of time. So I'll stop for precisely 5 minutes, see how much of the 16 you can do in that time. All right, let us try and do this as expeditiously as possible. Number 1 on page 11. Who knows what that is? Yes. Well, you said the drop context. That's correct, but what are we agreeing to call that? Call it oversimplified generalization if you don't want to say dicto simpliciter, or just dicto for short. Yes, that is definitely oversimplified generalization. And here the real issue is when you say man should live by reason, you're speaking in the context of his basic means of survival. And by what faculty should he guide his action and achieve his value? That's the context. There's nothing in that to exclude the use of force in self-defense and in retaliation against those who initiate it. And the person is simply taking that statement out of context and is erecting it into a false, out-of-context absolute, when in fact part of living by reason, as Objectivism argues, is the use of force in self-defense. And therefore this is obviously would be classified as dicto from the Objectivist point of view. Number 2. Yes? Now, you see, you said hasty generalization. That's okay, but if you say that, you're going to mix it up with oversimplified generalization. So if you say hasty generalizing, it'll make it a little clearer. Okay, that is certainly hasty generalizing. From 3 concretes, immediately generalization, which is unwarranted. What about a passionate love of truth? What about a passionate love of freedom? What bad consequences do they lead to? Therefore, there's obvious negative instances. Number 3. Yes. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. Correct. You can just say post hoc. Wars intensify after industrialization, therefore because of it. And here, of course, the actual facts are that 2 completely opposite trends happen to intersect. The Aristotelian trend, which led to industrialization, and the Kantian trend, which led to war. And therefore, they're taking a factor from 2 different trends, which happen to intersect and identifying them as a causally related. So that's a classic example of post hoc. Number 4. This is perhaps a slightly trickier one. Controls lead to further controls, and therefore there's no escape from dictatorship, and therefore we're doomed. Now, it's true that controls lead to further controls. So where did this go wrong? I seem to have only ladies this evening. Yes? Oversimplified generalization or dicto simpliciter. Why? Exactly right. Neglecting free will. You have to keep the full context. Once you start imposing controls, it's true that each control will necessarily lead to further controls, so long as the country remains on the premise of having control. But it's always free until the very last stages to revise its philosophy, revise its premises, scrap all the controls, and start a free system. So there's no historical determinism, and you cannot convert the fact that controls lead to controls into a statement of determinism, and therefore that is obviously dicto. Number 5. Children of wealthy men go on expensive vacations, so if you want to get rich, you should send me to Acapulco. Yes? Reversing cause and effect, right. Being rich is the cause, going to Acapulco, I had in mind a high-class hotel, is the effect, not the other way around. Number 6, you have no right to murder, rob, etc. Therefore, there's no such thing as an absolute right to freedom. And then for the same price, he throws in his definition. Freedom only means whatever the government happens to permit you to do. So that's a Nazi definition of freedom. What's wrong with this? Now, you could argue that this commits 2 different fallacies. Who has any one fallacy? The gentleman at the back. You say improper analysis. Improper analysis applies to the use of Mill's methods. Which one of Mill's methods is here being used? I don't see any of Mill's methods. He's simply giving a number of instances. The government can validly say you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. Therefore, the government can validly say you can't do anything. That's the essence of his argument. And that would be, yes, in the front. Hasty generalizing, obviously. What also you could say is that it contains an addition and equivocation. Equivocation on what? On the phrase absolute right to freedom. Because if absolute right to freedom means the right to do anything you want, including the violation of the rights of others, then of course you don't have it. But that is not a valid use of the concept absolute right to freedom. In its valid meaning, it would mean you have the right to take any actions to achieve your values on the basis of your own judgment, understanding that that is specified in a context which grants everyone else the same right. In that context, you do have an absolute right. So it's really an equivocation on an absolute right to freedom in addition. Number 7, that babies must be evil because none of them are independent, and independence is a major virtue. What's wrong with that? Lady at the back. That's dicto, right. When you say independence is a major virtue, you obviously presuppose at an age where it's possible. You could just as well say all babies are rotten because they're parasites. They're not productive, you know. But obviously these virtues apply when you have a functioning human being. Number 8, there's been a huge growth in government controls, and at the same time, a vast number of unprecedented new inventions. And therefore, the controls are the cause of creativity, and if we had complete dictatorship, we'd have perfect creativity. That is what fallacy at the very front?
Yeah, after this, because...
After this, therefore, because of this, or in Latin, post hoc. Creativity came after the controls, therefore because of the controls. And of course it ignores altogether the question, how much greater would the creativity and the new inventions have been if people had been free and not hampered by all the controls? Number 9, this campaign speech against Dewey, in which he said that in 1864 there were only 2 cases of rape in New York City, but in 1939, with Mr. Dewey as prosecutor, there were 73 rape cases in the courts. Why this appalling increase in rape under the administration of Mr. Dewey? And that is what? The rape increased post hoc, after Dewey, therefore, because of Dewey, and obviously the relevant factor is the difference between 1864 and 1939, with everything that implies. And it could also include how well records were kept in 1864. Number 10, that's a pure propaganda, left-wing propaganda. Munitions makers are the cause of wars. After all, you can't fight a war without weapons. Weapons are necessary for wars, therefore weapons are the cause of wars. In the green. Or you say reversing cause and effect. You mean the wars are the cause of weapons? Well, you might say the desire for war is the cause of weapons, which is simply an effect, rather than the weapons being the cause of wars. I hadn't thought of that, but you could say that. I had in mind a different fallacy here, but that would be a very valid point. Yes, this gentleman. Confusing a necessary condition with a cause. The most you could say is that you can't fight a war without weapons. They're necessary for a war, at least for a modern full-scale war. But obviously that is a minor necessary condition. The major one is statist governments. Number 11. Why can't I condemn the law of gravitation? He's got serious objections, and he heard that man was supposed to use his mind and be critical of everything. So he used his mind, and he ends up with a criticism of the law of gravity. Well, what's wrong with that? Trying to get somebody different. Yes. That's dicto simpliciter. There's no, if this is supposed to be objectivism, objectivism does not say man is supposed to be critical of everything. He's supposed to be critical of everything man-made, everything subject to human volition. And critical here doesn't necessarily mean that he's supposed to be against everything man-made, but that it is subject to his rational criticism. But here, of course, the distinction, the context that's relevant, is the distinction between the metaphysical and the man-made, to which I refer you to Miss Rand's article. But if something is a part of reality, it is exempt from criticism. That's the nature of existence. And the rational man simply says, yes, that's the way things are, period. Number 12, healthy men have healthy sex lives, etc. Now that isn't even a parody. That is, in effect, Freudianism encapsulated as far as it applies to health. Yes. Post hoc. No, I wouldn't think post hoc implies simply a coincidental relation between the two. One comes after the other, therefore because of it, but in fact the two are coincidentally connected. But I think there is a real causal relation between being psychologically healthy and having a healthy sex life. So it's not a coincidence. It's not simply a temporal connection. But there is a huge error in this statement of the causal relationship. So it's not that it's a coincidence, but what? The lady on the left there. Reversing cause and effect, making sex the cause of psychological health rather than the effect. Number 13, the Germans are innately vicious. They started the war in 1870, World War I, World War II. Now, this is a trickier one. Which method of mill is being used in this example? How many cases? 3 cases, right? All cases have the same effect, namely what? War. So it's what method? Method of agreement. And the individual thinks he found a factor that is the one factor in common, namely that it's Germans who started it. And so he draws the conclusion that the Germans are the cause, they must be innately rotten. Now, would you say then that this is the fallacy of emphasizing irrelevant factors? No, I wouldn't. I do not think it's irrelevant that the Germans started those wars as against, for instance, the Americans. But, so I would not object to this on the ground that it's irrelevant. I think this is just like the lemonade example. The lemonade is the carrier of the real cause, and you have to correctly analyze it. And in the same way, the Germans are the carrier in these cases of the real cause. And what was the real thing the Germans had in common, in contrast to other countries at this time, Western countries? They were heavily statist from the word go. And therefore, the person didn't get an irrelevant factor, but he improperly analyzed it. He makes it an issue of innate corruption of the Germans, which of course is philosophically untenable, and doesn't properly analyze his factors. So this would be the method of agreement, fallacy of improper analysis. 14. Man depends on his grocer for food, his teachers for education, his doctor for medical treatment, etc. Therefore, there's no such thing as independence. You depend on others for everything. For everything. Well, I can see two different fallacies here, one inductive and one from our earlier discussion at the beginning of the course. Who wants to specify one? Yes, in the front. Well, you insist on saying generalization. Generalizing. Hasty generalizing. Right. Hasty generalizing. He gives you a few concretes and he concludes, therefore, you depend on others for everything, when there's obviously many things you do entirely on your own. But now, aside from that point, suppose it were true that you depended on men for all the products that you engaged in. Would it follow there's no such thing as independence? Yes. Equivocation in that case on independence. Does independence mean living on a self-sustaining farm or a desert island and never dealing with others? Or does independence mean earning what you get by producing the value equivalent in trading? And in that latter case, which would be the objectivist definition of independence which we discussed last week, you cannot conclude that these people are dependents simply because they, quote, depend on a process of trade. So that would be hasty generalizing and equivocation. And number 15, there's a high correlation between the intellectual development of a society and its industrial development. So if we want to raise the intellectual level of the world's primitive countries, send them lots of American machinery. And that is, in effect, the basis of part of American foreign policy. Yes, I think it's a lady at the back or gentleman, I can't see. Yes, the one that's looking around, yes. Reversing cause and effect, obviously the intellectual development causes the industrial development, not the other way around. This is an example of a Marxist viewpoint, that the machines will condition the thinkers. And number 16, finally, a man has a right to use his property any way that he wants to. This is my hammer. Therefore, I have a right to crack you on the skull with it if I want to. I heard a variation of that argument from an alleged defender of free enterprise who shall be nameless. So I don't get any credit for originality here. This was actually offered by somebody. What is this one? Yes. Dicto again. You have your right to use your property any way that you want to within the framework of respecting the rights of others. Right. All right, let us see. We have about 12 minutes or so left. Let us see what we can get done on the definitions, and here I will not ask for volunteers, but simply tell you my analysis briefly. If we could do one a minute, we would be caught up, and that would permit next week some time for accumulated written questions, of which I have a number which are interesting, which I'd like to say something about, but let's get done what we can. We finished through 14, plus 3 later ones that we gave positive definitions to. So let us pick up on number 15 on page 8 and just hit a few high points. 15 on page 8. Sleep is a loss of consciousness which occurs repeatedly, especially when one is in bed. Now, that is obviously hopeless. Much too wide. It includes comas, fainting, being knocked out. If a man had a coma repeatedly when he was in bed, he'd be sleeping. Obviously, you have to distinguish sleep from many other forms of loss of consciousness, so it's too wide. It's also obviously too narrow by referring to being in bed. Sleep does not apply just to bed or just to human beings. Animals can sleep also, and they don't sleep in bed. So that's beside the point. So it's too wide and too narrow. If you ask me for a direction without attempting a definition, I would say that you would have to include in the definition of sleep something to the effect that it is a natural or normal rest of the living organism. To distinguish it, you see, from coma and fainting and knockout, etc. And you'd have to say it involves the suspension of consciousness and of volitionally initiated action, the suspension at least of external action. And I myself think, since sleep is a state of the organism, it involves not only the suspension of consciousness, external consciousness, but also certain physiological functions which it performs, which I wouldn't begin to go into, which I don't even think are fully known. But a full definition of sleep, I think, should properly include a statement of its physiological purpose to get rid of waste products or whatever, and that would be an essential that would explain then the rest of a fundamental that would explain the rest of the physiology involved in sleep. But that is a very complex, specialized one. And we're only concerned with the general direction, not a specific definition. Number 16. A cause is any agent or action which brings about a consequence or result. This is the fallacy of circularity twice. One, via the term consequence or result, which is simply a correlative of cause. The same reason why you can't define cause in terms of effect, because that raises the question, then you have to define effect in terms of cause. You can't define cause in terms of consequence or result, because those are simply consequence or result of a cause, so you go back in a circle. It's also circular in its use of the verb bring about, because what does bring about mean? Cause. Therefore, this statement literally says a cause is any agent or action which causes something that comes from a cause. And therefore, it is circular twice over. Now, for a proper direction, as in the case of all correlatives, of which cause and effect is one, you define the relationship involved. In other words, you would define the relationship of causation or causality. And there I would say that, again, to indicate a direction, that is essentially a relationship between an entity and its mode of action. That is the genus. It's a relationship between an entity and its mode of action, and the differential would have to include the idea that the action follows necessarily from the nature of the entity. Or put another way, that any alternative to that action would contradict the nature of the entity. That's the essential concept, I would say, of what is meant when you say an action is caused by an entity, that any alternative to that action would contradict the nature of the entity. Now, where are we now? 17, we did freedom. So we turn to 18, Republican. An American interested in politics, who's not a Democrat or an independent, doesn't favor capitalism or socialism and tries to win elections. Well, the first obvious thing to say is that this is negative. And not a Democrat or an independent does not tell you what a Republican is. So it's negative. Not in favor of capitalism or socialism. That is negative. In addition, it's too narrow. There are many apathetic Republicans who are not interested in politics and don't care whether they win elections and never vote. So it's negative and too narrow. Now, if you ask me, what is the common denominator among all Republicans, including the whole spectrum of their political views, I would say, if you tried to define this concept, there is no common denominator. There is no ideological common denominator. Not one blessed thing that I know of. The only way you could define a Republican, I believe, is you'd have to say a registered member of one of two of the major U.S. political parties. And if you think that's too vague, specify the address of headquarters of the party. That's all you could do, because I don't know anything else in common among Republicans except that they call themselves that and are registered as such with the election board. Number 19. Now, this is an interesting one. Logic is man's method of knowledge. The one which, properly used, assures reliable conclusion. Now, here the genus is perfectly fine. Man's method of knowledge, you couldn't do better. I mean, you can say art or science, depending on the context, but method of knowledge is perfectly legitimate. The trouble here comes with the differentia. But the differentia is definitely equivalent. It's not too wide or too narrow. It is the method which assures reliable conclusions. Logic does, and only logic does. So it's not that it violates the rule of equivalence. But what is wrong with this differentia? There's only one thing wrong with it. Yes, sir. How is it circular? You mean because reliable is defined in terms of logical? No, I did not intend reliable conclusions to be defined in terms of logical. I meant by reliable conclusions, conclusions which you can be confident conform to reality, which are concepts that you can define independently of logic. So I did not intend circularity by that. Something else, yes. It is not fundamental. It does not tell you what is the method. It simply gives you a result of the method. The result being that if you use it, your conclusions will be reliable. But what is the method? After all, a definition is supposed to tell you what something is, not simply what it does or what a consequence of it is. So it's a perfect example of a violation of the rule of fundamentality only. And of course, the proper definition would have to tell you what is the essence of the method, namely, that it's a method which involves non-contradictory identification. 20 we did, and that takes us to 21. That monstrous mouthful from John Dewey's logic, which I won't even begin to read. Obviously, you could criticize this on endless grounds. I put it in simply because it's a very famous definition by Dewey, and it is blatantly an example. If you had to pick just one rule, and you could probably say it's wrong on every rule, but if you had to pick just one, this is blatantly an example of obscurity. John Dewey was famous for his horrible literary style. It's true of a great many American philosophers in contrast to British philosophers. And this is a perfect example of it. I should say on Dewey's behalf, however, that he is giving an accurate definition of inquiry from the perspective of his philosophy. If you translated this into English, the essential idea is reality in itself, apart from man, is nothing in particular. It lacks any identity. It is indeterminate metaphysically. Inquiry is the process in which human beings create identity. Our conclusions create reality and make it into something particular. That is actually the theory of pragmatism, and that is his idea here. Inquiry is the transformation of the indeterminate into something determinate, which is his way of saying what is the essential idea of pragmatism. Inquiry is the method by which human beings create reality, which apart from them was nothing in particular. And so, in that sense, you couldn't fault Dewey except for the impossible language. But from the point of view of his philosophy, he's giving an accurate definition, if needlessly obscure. The whole trouble with it, therefore, is that his philosophy is all wrong. But that's then a philosophic issue. 22. We did 23. Certain means free from doubt. And there, of course, the fundamental error is it is negative. Negative. It does not tell you what certain is. Free from in that connection is just a negative. Certain means not possessed of doubt, not characterized by doubt. Of course, it's true that if something is certain, it's not doubtful, but that is simply a consequence of it being certain. And therefore, you could also argue this is not fundamental. For a positive direction for the definition of certain, you would have to say as its genus something like evidential status, or cognitive status of a conclusion. And then the differentia, you'd have to distinguish it from probable and possible. And you would say something is certain, some proposition or idea, when this is the objectivist theory, when all of the available evidence, not just some and not even just the preponderance, but the totality of the available evidence favors that conclusion. And nothing points in any other direction than according to objectivism, it would be certain. Now there again, that's an epistemological issue. You'd have to establish a whole epistemology to do it. Number 24. God is an infinite supernatural being transcending time, space, and matter. And there's only one thing wrong with this definition, or more accurately, the same thing 5 times. Namely, negative. God is infinite, simply means non-finite. Supernatural, non-natural. Transcending time, not in time. And same for space and matter. So what this definition tells you is, God is something which is not infinite, natural, temporal, spatial, or material. Well, very good. What is it? No answer at all. And of course, that's one of the central philosophic objections to the concept or term God. No positive definition has ever been given. And of course, no positive definition, you could argue, can be given for anything like this which is inherently supernatural. The closest that anyone has come to a positive definition of God is to describe him as the creator of the universe, which is at least positive. However, it has many objections, but even so, creator simply tells you his action. It doesn't tell you what he is. It doesn't define the entity, simply an act he took. And no positive definition has ever been offered. Well, I'm afraid we'll have to leave education, garbage, chance, and reading to next week, along with a collection of questions I've had and analogies and the homework on Mill's method, so we have a full schedule for next week, and I'll see you then.